Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 7's lecture on biodiversity. We're going to look at two sections here. We're going to look at why biodiversity is so important, and then we're going to close off here with the human effects on biodiversity and how certain organisms are adapting or being threatened by climate change. So let's look at biodiversity first. So there's a few things we can look at. It's a description of all the different levels of organization. So you can see down at the picture, there's different types. You could have genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is looking at the differences in DNA among individuals, and notice this is going to be the same individuals. So how is genetic diversity among members of the same population? It could be humans, it could be frogs, it could be any sort of that. And genetic diversity usually helps when there's changes in the environment or there's diseases through a population. So having genetic diversity usually helps that organism survive. We have species diversity. This is looking at a given area. So here you have your middle picture. How many species are in a given area, in a forest, in a wetland, in a tundra? So that gives us a very good idea of biodiversity. And finally, we can look at the ecosystem as a whole. So before, when we were looking at species, now with an ecosystem diversity, we're looking at the entire habitat. We're looking at the communities, not only the communities themselves, but how they interact with other populations within that ecosystem. And moving forward, we're just going to touch briefly on how we classify these. You're going to learn more about this in biology, but the whole key to classification is you're going from a very broad, which we'll start at the bottom, is domain is very broad, and genus is extremely specific. And I think looking at this picture will help give us an idea. So for example, we can start up at the top with our kingdom, and you can all agree that all the animals here at this top chart, going from the butterfly to the pig to the bears, those are all animals. And as we go further down, we're eliminating certain things, like notice the butterfly isn't there anymore. The butterfly is not there, not because it's not an animal, it is. The butterfly is not in the phylum Chordata because it doesn't have a backbone. Chordata, these animals all have backbones. And then again, we're going down to mammal, carnivores, and so on, until we're most specific in order to grizzly bear. So if we go backwards, we can see which animals the grizzly bear is most related to, and vice versa. So that's all taxonomy is. And looking at biodiversity, where animals and plants are distributed, we know there's about 50 to 30 million species on Earth. We're finding more every day, but unfortunately we're also losing species every day to extinction. And they're very difficult to identify. One, they could be located in a very hard to get to area. They may only live in one specific spot. They may be too small, and so on. So the important thing is we know that they're out there. We're losing them every day, and it's important to find these different types of animals in order to, one, gives us the health when there's more organisms in an area, when there's more biodiversity, the ecosystem's healthier. And what we have noticed is that the closer we are to the equator, given that there's more water and there's higher temperatures, that's where we expect to see the most biodiversity. And what biodiversity is, why it's so important, is because the ecosystem actually provides services for us. And what I mean by services, it could be things like pest control, whereas you and I might pay for someone to spray our house and maybe keep things like cockroaches or scorpions out. There's certain plants or animals that do a good job on their own. Or you can look at a wetland. A wetland is an extremely important resource to humans because it cleans the water before we take it out. So that's what we mean by an ecosystem service. And as I mentioned before, the more biodiversity, usually there's more ecosystem services. And the whole goal of this is to have a stable ecosystem. I want you to be very careful. There's a difference between resistant and resilient, and we're going to look at this graph here at the bottom to help us out. So when we say something is resistant, that means if there's a change going on, maybe it's temperature, maybe it's weather, maybe it's a lack of a resource, lack of water. These are, if you're resistant, you can you'll lose function. You won't lose function without this resource. If you are resilient, that means you will bounce back. You're going to be affected. There might be a little drop in populations, but resilience will allow us to go on. So resistance and resilience are important in order for biodiversity to occur. If an organism cannot survive maybe a disease or a climatic event, notice here we have collapse. So again, resilient and resistance, make sure you know the difference between the two and their importance to biodiversity. Some other things with biodiversity. One is you can see here that Taxol. We'll talk about the medicine in a second, but even agriculture. So with having beneficial traits through artificial selection, we can determine which crops may do better than others in a certain area to provide us food. As I mentioned earlier, we have medicine, lots of different medicines, especially anti-cancer drugs, antiviral, all these different types of drugs that can be used to fight diseases are found in plants, especially in the rainforest areas, which we're unfortunately losing. And then ecotourism. I'm sure all of you have participated in maybe whale watching or any sort of activity that leads you outside, either observing animals or walking through nature or a national park. Then you've participated in ecotourism. So again, more benefits to having biodiversity. In 7.2, we're going to look at this the effects of biodiversity loss and unfortunately the effects of extinctions, which means, remember, if you are extinct, you are gone forever. So this guy in the picture here, our passenger pigeon, they used to be hundreds of thousands. You'd see them in the sky in North America. Today, they are extinct. So extinction is forever. So there's a few things to point out. When we talk about extinctions now, it's important to mention that we are currently in our 6th mass extinction. There have been mass extinctions in Earth's past, 5 of them. The important thing now, we are in a mass extinction, but this is the first time it's been caused by an organism on the Earth, and that organism is humans. So right now we are currently in our 6th mass extinction, which is anthropogenic, which is caused by humans. And again, we have this background extinction. There's organisms that are going to go extinct. That happens naturally, and it's happened in Earth's past. Mass extinction is when we lose a lot of organisms all at once. So what's at risk here? So we know we can't put an exact number on it, but remember our natural background extinction rate, it occurs about 1 species at a time. Right now we're either 100 to 1,000 times greater. So in 2009, there were 1,321 species that were classified as endangered, extinct. Make sure you know the difference between the two. I shouldn't have said extinct. Threatened. Endangered means there's serious risk. So this panda we would like to call endangered because pretty soon they could become extinct. The numbers are so low. Threatened means they're likely to become endangered. So if you're to pick one of the two, you'd rather be threatened than endangered. But again, threatened is not a good sign either, which that also means your population is going down. And what we'll do is we'll look at more in this chapter is this planet index. What we do is almost like when you go to the doctor, they look you over, they look at all your vitals. If we look at the planet as a whole, if we look at the land, the water, the ocean, and we can take into what's going on in regards to the biodiversity of those areas, we get an idea of the health of the earth as well. So what are some causes? There's a lot of different causes. There could be habitat change. Again, a lot of these are caused by humans, habitat change based primarily on cities spreading out into more rural areas. Invasive species we've talked about before, but people, not on purpose, but bringing organisms into an area that do so well, they outcompete the native species. Pollution, air, water, land, and then overharvesting. In this case, we're talking about trees. Cutting trees down and maybe not planting or not allowing the area to grow back before cutting them down again. So what's going on with habitat change and loss? So what happens is it's incredibly important to point out that this is the major reason for biodiversity loss. Imagine if this was your home, all of a sudden it starts getting broken up into more and more smaller pieces. You're going to have some detrimental effects. And as I just mentioned, smaller pieces, that's what we mean by fragmentation. When things are in fragments, they're in patches. And you can see here is that down by the time we get to 4, there are these fragments where we once had this original habitat. What we have is these smaller habitats now, can't support higher populations, and we see a biodiversity in decline. Invasive species we've been talking about, but again, these are from another area. They don't have predators that would have normally kept their populations in check. They usually take advantage of the weather. Some come from a colder climate to a warmer where they don't have a season like the winter that would maybe kill them off or prevent their growing. And what happens is they just come in and they just outcompete the native species. And what we start to see here is the native species declining, which results in biodiversity declining as well. And finally, climate change. We're going to talk about a lot in this class, but because the climate is constantly changing, we're going to see biodiversity being lost as well. We talked about that genetic diversity at the beginning. Some animals are going to be able to withstand the changes taking place in regards to higher sea levels, or in the case in the picture, the lack of sea ice at the North Pole in the Arctic Circle for the polar bears. But because of this changing, we're most likely going to see a negative effect on biodiversity. And just to stay up with the times, this has been recently came out, the panel that took in account on Earth's climate and its effects on the United States. The report basically came up because of climate change, we're going to see a huge effect not only on our lives, our health, on biodiversity, but economy as well. So this was published. You can look it up. It's the climate report, came out on the Friday, Black Friday in 2018. And again, you can take a look at that. And it goes to show you that the damages that you can expect because of this changing climate.